So this is a video that I feel I should probably make because I enjoy black powder firearms. As a matter of fact, I was talking to a buddy of mine, Big Boy Rabbit, through email. He is a guy who runs the YouTube channel Mississippi Milsurp. Go check him out. And he's also a big fan of black powder. I was talking to him and I just kind of got the urge to make black powder content. So in my time of making black powder content, I've made plenty of it on this channel. You can go back and watch any amount of it. But I've had a lot of people tell me that they had no idea black powder cartridges existed. Normally when you think of a cartridge, let me find me an example here. Probably should have had that on the ready. There we go. This'll work. I got some PPU 65 Carcano. Normally with a cartridge in the modern day, you're going to think of something along the lines of this right here. Brass case, copper jacketed bullet. Most people just think that right there is basically the standard, and for the most part something like this right here is the standard from like the 1880s 1890s and onward. So the French made smokeless powder in 1883 and adopted it in 1886 in their Lebel rifles. And since that time period, smokeless cartridges and smokeless cartridge technology has completely redefined how firearms operate and how warfare is done. But the time period before that smokeless cartridge technology existed, a lot of people think that basically all firearms technology at that time period, because it is black powder, is old school muzzle loading technology. Things like this right here. This is a flintlock that I picked up not too terribly long ago. I got videos coming up on it. I've always wanted a flintlock. I'm very, very excited for this one. But anyway, a lot of people think that black powder technology and black powder firearms are specifically just muzzle loaders and muskets and maybe a few breech loading systems, and maybe they know enough to think of paper cartridges and things like that. But they don't really realize that there are black powder cases and cartridges out there, like full-on black powder cartridges. Normally they think of repeating firearms for black powder like, say, revolvers that are cap and ball and percussion cap. There are plenty of other options out there that are actually black powder firearms that take cartridges. Like, for example, this is actually another revolver that takes a black powder cartridge. This is, I think this is an Ivory Johnson. I believe that this is either a first or a second model. I can't quite remember. But it is chambered in .32 Smith & Wesson, and it takes a cartridge, but that cartridge is a black powder cartridge. I believe that these were popular in the 1890s or the 1880s, sometime around that time period, but they came out before the first United States commercially available smokeless powder cartridge, which was the 30-30 Winchester, which came out in 1894. Every cartridge before that was black powder, and this is one of the ones that came out before that. So that is an example of a cartridge firing black powder firearm. Now, actually, one of the earliest examples of a cartridge firing black powder firearm and cartridge is something like this right here. This is, one second, let me close this, get that out of the way. This is actually an 1892 model. This is a Rossi, but the 1880 or the 1860 Henry is what it is that we're going to be talking about here. I just do not own an 1860 Henry, so I'll be using this for representation purposes. Old school lever actions, which came about the time of the Civil War, were actually chambered in cartridges. You needed cartridges in order to operate the old school lever actions, or you needed, in the case of like the volcanic, some sort of a hollow bullet. Like this right here is a minié ball, and it's got a hollow base inside of it. This right here would actually be filled with gunpowder and a priming system, and that right there would be what sets the bullet off and sends it downrange. So it's kind of like caseless ammunition, but it does the same thing that a cased ammo would do, just with less steps. But in order to operate a lever action, you need that sort of powder and ignition system. It's not a muzzle loader. So this right here is one of the earliest systems that take cartridges. It came about in the 1860s, and the feeding system was a little bit different. The locking system was a little bit different than what we have right here. But the general idea concept of the firearm and how it functions, at least mechanically speaking, is pretty gosh darn similar. Now, in the case of those old school Henry rifles, they were actually chambered in 44 Henry rimfire. This right here is an original example of what you would come to expect. So this is actually a 38 caliber round, but it is an original black powder round. This is a rimfire round. You even have the H on the back. This is actually a copper case round way back in the day before brass technology was really all that great, and just before cartridge technology had really developed all that much. Cartridges were made out of copper. And this is a really good example of exactly that. A copper case, rimfire round, black powder. This is what you would come to find back in the day of these old school black powder cartridges. So a Henry rimfire would be chambered in something like this, but more the size of this right here, approximately. And it took like 16 rounds of ammunition, if memory serves me correct. It was a 44 caliber projectile that had 28 grains of black powder behind it. So not exactly all that powerful of a round, not exactly all that powerful of a cartridge in general, but it was, in fact, a cartridge that used black powder, and that's the whole point of the topics that we are discussing nowadays. And that is one of the first cartridge firing systems out there, a lever action in a 44 caliber rimfire black powder cartridge. So that right there is an example of a cartridge in black powder that came out in the 1860s, like some 30-something years before smokeless powder came out. And this right here is an example of a firearm chambered in that. Not long after that, the United States was experimenting with trapdoor systems. This right here is a beautiful example of an 1873 trapdoor Springfield. And these right here were systems that became popular during this particular time period because the United States was trying to convert old muzzle loaders into this trapdoor system so they could fire cartridges. And that worked out well for the most part, but they had some well, what would you call it, experimentation issues whenever it came to these. At first, they chambered these for a 50-70, actually, I think it was a 58 caliber rimfire cartridge, and then a 50-70 black powder cartridge. And then, now, these are all cartridges. These are, I believe, at the time, copper case cartridges. And then they eventually went to a 45-70 in the 1873 Trapdoor, which is what I have right here. Absolutely gorgeous rifle. Look at this thing. Way too long for me to get into camera in one shot with what I have with this setup. But this is an example of a black powder cartridge firing rifle from the 1870s. So this right here, actually I have an example of an original 1873 black powder round. This right here is another copper case round. It is a center fire round, so I guess if you could manage, you could reload these, depending on whether or not it's Boxer or Bird Prime. I'm not quite sure about that one. But anyway, this right here is an original black powder round. There's no movement inside of it because black powder has to be compressed in order to avoid overpressure of the cartridges. There should be approximately 70 grains of black powder inside this thing, and the projectile here should be either a 300 grain or a 405 grain projectile, depending on whether or not this right here was designed for cavalry or infantry use. I'm not entirely sure. I have not pulled this bullet, but there you guys go. That is an original copper 45-70 round in black powder. This is another example of a black powder cartridge. Now, during these time periods where these cartridges were being developed, just because of the firearms for the time period, repeating rifles tended to be of a weaker cartridge, like the 44 Henry rimfire, just because they did not have all that great of a locking system in them. And if you wanted a full power rifle, you basically were stuck with a single shot, because for the technology during the time period, that was just how they knew how to lock up their rifles strong enough to be able to handle that ammo. However, as time progressed, repeating rifles did in fact begin to see, well, black powder firearms did begin to see repeating rifle systems, and this is one example of them. This right here is sort of just a representation because I don't actually own one. This is a Steyr M95 straight pull rifle, and it is different than the black powder systems that were being used. Those black powder systems had a different locking system. But the concept is essentially the same on how these actually work. All you do, you pull your bolt back, and then you put a cartridge into the chamber by pushing your bolt forward. It very much is a modern style of bolt-action rifle. And this is just one of many, many examples out there. And these old-school Steyr bolt-action rifles took these right here. This is a clip of 11mm Steyr. And as you can see, it is very different than the cartridges, the smokeless powder cartridges that we know and love today. These particular rounds are black powder rounds, and the bullets are quite large on them. One of the main reasons why bullets were so large on these old school black powder rounds, like for example, the 4570, look at the size of that bullet. The reason why these bullets were so big was because black powder could only propel projectiles at certain velocities. So if you wanted more energy transfer onto your target, you had to have a bigger bullet because they could only go so fast. Smokeless powder changed that, and that's why we have much smaller bullets traveling much, much faster. So larger bullets just to get more energy transfer down on target. These particular ones, I can't quite remember whenever they came out, sometime in the 1880s. But they are a good example of a black powder round. And in this particular case, it looks like these are made of brass. So yeah, these did exist absolutely before smokeless powder technology. Now, once smokeless powder technology took off and we started loading smokeless powder cartridges, then we had militaries come out with all sorts of different stuff. Some of the main contestants that came out during that time period, this is not surplus ammo, but it's just what I have laying around. Some of the main contestants that came out during that time period were the 303 British, the 3040 Krag. I might have an example of that. My ammo drawer is just so unorganized. 303 British, 3040 Krag, 6.5 Carcano. I think 6.5 Jap came around that time period. 8mm Lebel, 7.62 by 54 rammed, a bunch of other stuff. 8mm Mauser, a 7mm Mauser as well, 7.65 Mauser as well. Mauser came out with a good number of different cartridges. A bunch of smokeless powder cartridges completely replaced the black powder cartridges that were in use. And the reason why we don't hear about these all that much and why people don't think that these existed is because whenever cartridge technology was existing with these black powder rounds, it didn't exist for very long. Basically, as soon as countries adopted these black powder cartridges, in the case of the United States in 1873 is whenever they made it their standard issue. Whenever they adopted these cartridges, it wasn't but like a decade or two later that countries started adopting smokeless powder rounds. So yeah, you had like 15 to 20 years or so of using black powder cartridges 150 years ago, and there's just not that much of this around because smokeless powder made these obsolete overnight, and countries went to use smokeless powder, and smokeless powder cartridges have been in use ever since, and that's one of the reasons why people just simply do not hear about these black powder cartridges. Alright, well, I think I've gone on long enough on this particular subject. I wanted to go ahead and just show off a couple of these to show that these do exist. These are, in fact, black powder rounds. This right here is black powder 4570. This right here is a black powder 38 rimfire. And this right here is actually a black powder 44 special. This is 44 Smith & Wesson. And this was a cartridge that came out and was designed in 1968. And this right here is an original example of that. So that is really, really cool. So these are a couple of cartridges that you could come to expect if we're talking about black powder rounds. Normally, they're going to be either small, lightweight rounds like this for either revolvers or repeaters, or full power rifle cartridges like what we see right there. Now, if we want to talk about black powder shotguns, those did exist as well. Most of the time, they were like either a brass case shotgun shell, like what we, or either a brass or copper case shotgun shell, like what we see right here, or they were paper cartridges. That was also extremely common for the time period, simply because those were very easy to make. And I might go more in-depth into black powder shotguns at a later time period. So if you guys want to see more of that, then let me know in the comments below, and I will look into showing some of that off. Anyway, folks, thanks for watching. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off. Have yourself a fantastic day. I will see you guys in the next episode.
Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. The poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.